Good afternoon, everybody. I want to welcome you to our latest series in Eno Center for Transportation webinars. My name is Robert Puentes. I am President and CEO of Eno, and I want to wish all of you my very best and hope you all are staying well and staying healthy at this time. Today is our latest in our webinar series, The Road to Recovery. The series focuses on leadership lessons and transportation strategies for our post-COVID future. You can tune in every Wednesday to hear and interact with leaders across the transportation space who are going to share their firsthand knowledge and experiences on the road to recovery. And today I'm really excited that we have Jennifer Aument with us. Many of you know Jennifer. She oversees Transurban's business in North America, which includes operations of three very important roads here in metropolitan Washington: I-95, I-495, I-395, portions of those roads, with two major extensions in the works. They also operate one road in Montreal, Canada. Jennifer is expert in the development, financing, construction, and operations of major infrastructure. She and her team at Transurban are among those who pioneered the use of public-private partnerships, innovative technology, new financing strategies for major transportation projects all throughout the United States. Jennifer serves on a variety of boards and commissions and is also a member of Eno's board of directors. So really happy to have Jennifer here with us. For those that are joining live, you can submit questions using the questions function on the webinar website. You don't have to wait until any certain time to submit questions. You can send them in at any time. So with that, Jennifer, thank you so much for joining us. I will turn it over to you.
Thanks, Rob. I appreciate it. Thanks to you and the Eno team. It's a great pleasure to be here. As I mentioned, I typically spend the afternoon sitting in my living room talking about infrastructure by myself anyway, so I'm glad to link in. But it's a pleasure, and thanks to you and the Eno team for all that you do to drive the dialogue around transportation policy here in Washington and across the country. We're going to talk a little bit today about how our cities are changing post-COVID and about some solutions to overcome the obstacles to getting travelers, goods, and the economy moving again. But I am here in the greater Washington area, and I'm looking out my window, and there are signs everywhere in this city about an even greater challenge facing our communities. So I wanted to start very quickly with that before we move to some transportation solutions. I'm an employer. I know many of you on the webcast today are employers. And so at Transurban, we're taking this moment that's happening in our cities to reinforce to all of our employees that we denounce all forms of racism and to celebrate the diversity of our team and to challenge ourselves to continue to take action to further strengthen our culture of inclusion and respect. And I hope as employers you'll do the same. Our greatest challenge in the transportation industry, we all talk about it, is attracting the workforce we need to solve problems, some really big problems. It would be senseless for us to leave some exceptional talent on the sidelines because we fell short of creating those kinds of cultures in our work environment. So now I'll move on to COVID. We are spending a lot of time here at Transurban looking at what the future may look like in a post-COVID world and what roadways will look like in our major cities. And while our traffic forecasting team typically gets it pretty close, we actually don't have a crystal ball. But I will tell you that there are a few things that we know and trends that we're seeing. One, and this is obvious, and I suspect many of you here on the webinar are experiencing this firsthand. COVID has brought American transportation services to a halt. You will see Transurban's network globally is down 30, 40, even more. We're down 70% traffic on our major roadways here in the greater Washington area. That might be an enviable reduction in revenue relative to our partners who are operating ports, airports, and transit operations, particularly across the country. We know many transit operators are down 90% or 95% or more on revenue. We know that governments are facing a perfect storm of steep increases in spending while also trying to address the deep reductions in tax revenue. It's a spectacular stat out of the IMF that suggests that the government spending we've seen this spring to be able to address the COVID crisis is equal to 10% of global GDP. So remarkable spend and necessary to address the crisis, but has already created a problem. And now with steep declines in tax revenues, particularly in DOTs who rely on fees and gas tax, pretty serious situation, and particularly in those states who have a contractual or a constitutional obligation to balance their budgets. I was going through some announcements just this week. This is the last just few days. Kansas, $450 million short. Pennsylvania, $800 million short. North Carolina has announced that they've stopped mowing, much less stopped building. New Mexico is predicting $2 billion short, even 3 fiscal years out. And AASHTO, Jim Timon will tell you at AASHTO that they need $50 billion to support state DOTs across the country just to get them back up to the baseline where we were before 3 months ago, and to be able to keep those DOTs running and on track and projects moving forward. So severe crisis in funding to be able to address transportation. And lastly, one thing we know is COVID is going to change travel patterns in the midterm and will lead to continued declines in transit use and carpooling. We obviously have seen significant changes in travel patterns on some of the country's busiest routes like 95 and 495. We're starting to see Memorial Day traffic return a bit on that 95 corridor, but we know and we are realistic that changing travel patterns are going to be with us as transportation service providers for many months and years to come. Let's put that in the context of, particularly as it relates to transit. We have service about 120,000 transit customers a day on our Express Lanes network here in Washington. We know across the country, transit ridership was already declining post-COVID. Major agencies across the country, almost every major agency across the country lost ridership between 2017 and 2018. Per capita ridership was falling even faster, falling from 280 trips per urban resident down to just 38 trips per resident in 50 years' time here in the US. So the transit operators we know were already facing declines, and then came COVID. I know that my friend and colleague, director of the Virginia Department of Rail and Public Transportation, Jen Mitchell, is on the line right now. And Jen and her colleagues across the country are seeing significant challenges in dealing with transit ridership and the revenue impacts and the costs associated with maintaining and operating transit systems. If we look at Beijing as a lesson, is to see what we can expect here in the next coming months in terms of recovery. Months into the recovery post-COVID, Beijing transit outlets are still operating only at about 52% of their pre-COVID averages. So even months in, we're seeing a slow recovery there. And we can expect to see the same slow recovery here in the US. Many of you may have seen a recent IBM survey that came out last week that found that nearly 30% of American transit riders say they plan to use transit less over concerns over their health and the virus in this country. That should be no surprise. We experienced a bit of that we can take lessons from here in the US market. When after 9/11, it took 6 years for ridership to fully return in transit in that city. And even 10 years later, 24% of users of airlines said they still remain nervous and uneasy about flying. So we know that these transit preferences and users are going to continue, will have a lasting impact for COVID, we suspect, based on what we've seen in other countries and certainly what we've experienced here with crisis in the US market. So I'm a road girl, a toll road girl specifically, so you might think we would celebrate this change. And in fact, that couldn't be farther from the truth. The travel patterns that we would expect to see with the changing travel patterns associated with COVID, including the decline in transit use, put our transportation networks at risk and will create some really challenging congestion issues in cities across the country that, as all transportation professionals, we're going to have to address. If you look at Beijing right now, back to China, you'll see the congestion levels in peak periods in the city in Beijing are 52% higher than they were pre-COVID. That is an unsustainable congestion level and something that our cities here certainly would not welcome, and issues we'll have to solve. In Washington, we got a really good preview of what the challenge that we'll face in terms of road congestion with declining rail ridership with WMATA's recent Safe Track. In 2017, for those of you not familiar in the Washington transit system, WMATA did a large maintenance of really critical, important safety maintenance called Safe Track, and it had long-term closures of their rail system. What we saw is 15% of those rail users who opted not to use the metro got onto Virginia roadways like Braddock Road, Gallows, 495, 95. And a few of those returned to WMATA after that Safe Track. And so what we have seen on certain major roadways in Virginia as a result is after Safe Track went into effect, we saw a 24% decrease in speeds along major arterial routes. And then the general purpose lanes, or the main lanes on 95 at the Beltway, actually dropped 33% in speeds. So the lack of transit ridership and decrease in transit ridership really is a very serious issue for transit operators and for the services that they must and it's critical that they provide. But it's also a big, can be a significant concern for those of us on the highway and road network side who will have big problems to solve with these trends. I know many of you are probably sitting in your office saying, okay, so spending's down or spending's up, revenue's down, people aren't riding transit, people aren't carpooling because of safety reasons, and they won't be for a while. But what about work from home? And that's absolutely right. And our experts here at Transurban are looking very closely at those trends, and we absolutely expect to see in the near term and midterm, maybe as high as even double-digit growth in working from home for those professionals in big cities, for those professionals who can do that coming out of the COVID crisis and changing preferences because of what we've all been through here over the last few months. But you have to put that change in context when you're looking at the size and the scale of the problem that we need to solve in roadways in our major cities. Even before COVID, we saw an annual growth of e-commerce between 13 and 16%. Delivery trucks were already on track to grow 36% in the next decade. And that's before we even talk about the impact of autonomous vehicles and how that will increase overall vehicle miles traveled in the decades to come. And so, yes, working from home will increase, but it cannot be the solution and will not be this does not have the ability to actually tackle the major congestion that will soon return to cities across the U.S. So let's talk about solutions. I have a feeling, for those of you who are not aware, DeFazio is actually, Chairman DeFazio is actually this afternoon announcing some plans that the House Democrats have that I know that we've long awaited to see to address funding transportation needs in the U.S. today. And while we all are scouring this afternoon to look through that bill, at first glance, the team will tell you they're about $140 billion short in meeting their 5-year goal of about $500 billion of money to put in to transportation to both address the recovery from COVID and to also help us build and modernize and move our transportation system forward here in the U.S. So we are, even with that best case scenario solution, we're far short of meeting the goals, and there is no funding source identified to be able to fund the solutions that we will then, of course, be talking about this afternoon in the weeks and months to come as Congress considers how to address this need. So we need to continue as a country to look for innovative transportation solutions that go above and beyond traditional sources to be able to help address this transportation need. And the dynamics that I've described from COVID have taken a challenge that we have faced here as transportation professionals and intensified it because of the stress that is on state DOT budgets, because of the stress that is on transit operators, as governments lean in to solve problems for transportation service providers, those problems are even greater to solve. So now I feel like we probably had this conversation in 2005. The profound statement to say private capital and public-private partnerships might be part of that solution to be able to ensure that governments can free up resources to address other needs for projects that make sense for this model. In fact, I have been saying that, and many of you have been saying that since before 2005. But here we are again, hoping that the great emerging market, as our global investors would tell you, America is seen as the United States is seen as the great emerging market for infrastructure investment that has been relatively slow to emerge. So I'm certainly hoping that with about $200 billion of dry powder out there, of private capital waiting to be deployed in this market, that we will find ways moving forward post-COVID to be able to use public-private partnerships to be able to help solve problems. I can tell you from our partners around the globe, there's continued to be, and here in the United States, continue to be significant appetite in the investment community for investments in infrastructure, including toll roads, and obviously you've seen an increase in broadband and other sectors and actual transactions that are moving forward and closing during this environment. So that appetite is still there. But I think in order to maximize the benefit of public-private partnerships here in this market, there are a few things that we need to do to address the model and to be able to ensure that it can be used effectively to meet transportation needs. One is to address the procurement at the state level, and this is a state issue, not a federal issue, to make sure that we are aligning, that state government decision makers are aligning their goals for the project with the type of procurement that they put out. We have seen large multi-billion-dollar public-private partnerships struggle in recent years, whether it's I-4, we've seen the news around the Purple Line, or other major projects across the country. And much of that is, it's not a public-private partnership issue, it's a mega project issue. Someone who's spent a lot of time developing major transportation projects, they're messy and hard and complex, and you have to meet a variety of stakeholder, environmental, and community needs, and that can be unpredictable and requires flexibility to be able to work through those issues, to be able to move projects forward. Unfortunately, when procurement officers sit down to write a procurement in the States, in the United States in recent years, they've moved to a more rigid approach, to that fixed price that has a risk profile that does not enable the public and private partners in the partnership to be able to work together and be flexible to address the problems that plague and the challenges and obstacles that plague all major infrastructure projects and the complexities. Procurements are too rigid to be able to address those, and they inevitably happen in large multi-billion-dollar projects. So we need to look at that and how we shape procurements to be able to meet the realities of these big projects. And I'm hopeful when you see governments like Governor Hogan in the Maryland Department of Transportation looking at a project development approach, something Transurban has done around the world that provides more flexibility to be able to meet needs and helps avoid cost overruns and community challenges that we see in more rigid procurement projects that where interests perhaps are not aligned between the partners. Another area where we can really work to do a step forward in using public-private partnerships here in the United States is to finally adopt and to advance a modern approach to asset recycling. I hate that phrase. It's overused and has a negative connotation here in Washington in some circles. But what it really is adopting long-term public-private partnerships on existing public assets. When we look at the opportunity here in the United States, Transurban would look at the top 10 largest public toll authorities and suggest that they're worth about $300 billion. And through the use of public-private partnerships, just on 10, you could net about $180 billion. That's, just for the record, $40 billion more than the gap identified today and mentioned to you about the bill that we're talking about today on the House side, or the Democrat side. So $180 billion that can fund greenfield transportation projects. But the actual opportunity with these kinds of asset recycling programs goes far beyond just funding. Transurban's experience in New South Wales, in Queensland, in the Australian market suggests that these kinds of partnerships, even more important than the funding that they could help free up and the value that they could untrap for governments to be able to use on new transportation projects, they actually have delivered massive improvements to customer service and transportation outcomes. For example, on the $7 billion toll road network that Transurban has acquired through a similar program in Brisbane, Queensland, we have been able to reduce fees for customers by $80 million in a single year. We have been able to decrease the incident response time by 40% and improve traveler safety on those roadways. So customers have more options, our teams are more diverse, our customers are paying less fees, and they're having a better travel experience. And what we have found, not just in an asset recycling partnership, but in tolling more broadly, is if you do take steps that start with how do you provide a better service and better outcome for customers in the community through these long-term partnerships, including in the US, opportunities to reduce tolls, to improve safety, to be able to reduce fees, to be able to improve the travel experience and reduce congestion, that's a better way for these projects and partnerships to be part of the solution. They're much more politically palatable, and they align the interests of the private partner, government, and the customers that use these facilities. So here in the United States, by looking at how we're procuring greenfield public-private partnerships and recognizing the need for flexibility in these major projects, and by looking at the existing public assets that states have and authorities have across the country, these are two opportunities to ensure that private capital can be part of the solution to the transportation needs that we have in the United States. Needs that we know are greater than if we'd sat here 30, 60, 90 days, and that have more funding constraints across the board as we all, as transportation professionals, work on solutions to meet them. So Rob, I'll stop there and then take any questions or continue the discussion.
It's fantastic, Jennifer. Thank you so much for the framing, and thank you for the clear and cogent remarks and for contextualizing it and exactly what's going on today. It's exactly what we were hoping we get. So thank you for doing that, and thank you for folks who've sending in questions. Continue to do that. We have about 45 minutes, no, about 25 minutes for some Q&A and some dialogue. So keep those questions coming in. And let me start off kind of collecting some of these that have come in already and frame it around this. You ticked through some of the challenges that are happening in states. You talked about what their fiscal conditions look like. You talked about what's happening in Pennsylvania, North Carolina. Let's just put a much finer point on this. So what do you think is happening to capital budgets, capital programming in states when it comes to transportation? I mean, obviously it's very grim. Have you seen that they're starting to make changes? Are they starting to reprioritize things? What do you see is happening right now?
Yeah, what we've seen is in states like Kentucky, you've seen states that are actually canceling procurements, broadly canceling procurements of major projects. I think what we'll see where the law allows is states will continue to utilize funds to maintain and operate their facilities where they should, addressing the safety issues. But while we've already had a very concerning trend of funding being dried up by maintenance and operations activities, it really leaves very little funding available for capital projects and to be able to move forward with new modern transportation solutions. So that's obviously a big concern. One of them, we'll certainly see more of that. I have a lot of faith in state DOTs across the country. I think I have the pleasure of working with the most innovative partner in the country in Virginia, and with other DOTs across the country, and with a great partner at MTQ in Quebec. And I'll tell you, states have really sent a loud message over the last 10 years that they're not going to wait for Congress to come up with a transportation solution. They're seeing the federal contribution to their programs to continue to decline, and they are close to the problem and they are aggressive in solving it. And so that's why you've seen more 25 states increase the gas tax in recent years. That's why you've seen states turn to public-private partnerships and modern tolling solutions that will help deliver outcomes. Here in the Greater Washington area, Virginia welcomed Amazon's second headquarters and made another announcement last week about Microsoft. And it's because I think in no small part to Virginia being very aggressive in working creatively with the federal government, with their structure of fees, public-private partnerships, tolling, to be able to advance transportation solutions. So they have a very solid foundation here of transportation services, including our Express Lanes projects, because of the approach that they've taken. So I have a lot of faith in state DOTs. They know they're close to the problem. They've been through tough times, and I think that they'll solve the problem. I hope that they will look at solutions like public-private partnerships, asset recycling, and tolling as they continue to get what I would say scrappy and aggressive in addressing transportation needs.
And we've seen a lot of agencies having to get scrappy, creative, another word, I guess. This is a time for new ideas for sure. A few folks are wondering specifically about toll roads, I guess toll authorities in general. So what do you think the impact is on the toll roads specifically? Is it, I mean, a lot of them have bond covenants. Do you think there's going to be reductions in some of the capital investments there? Workforce reductions? What does the future look like, at least in the short term, for the toll roads and the authorities there?
Yeah, so I think if you're looking at toll roads, and I'll give a shout out to our colleagues at IBBTA who've done a fantastic job of helping to facilitate a lot of dialogue between toll road operators across the country during this COVID crisis. And I'll tell you, first and foremost, where there's consensus from operators here in the US is a focus on both employee safety and customer safety, first and foremost. And so you've seen toll roads transition to cashless. Transurban launched this year a product called GoToll, which is interoperable mobile tolling solution for customers that can be used across the EasyPass network. We're seeing states really increase interest in providing that kind of option as they've gone cashless with concern over employee safety. And obviously, toll road operators across the country are including Transurban, have colleagues who are on the front lines in control room operations, doing incident response. They have really been critical parts of our road network and regional networks, transportation networks during this crisis to be able to keep people moving. So I think toll road operators have been focused on customer and employee safety first, which is great. From the financial perspective, you are talking about a business. And I think sometimes in Washington, we forget that transportation is a business. And when your revenues are down, toll roads are a business. When your revenues are down 40, 50, 60, 70, 80, even 90% in toll roads across the country, that there will be implications that have to be dealt with in terms of ensuring that you can continue to meet your debt requirements and your operations. And of course, there will be enhancements and projects that will be deferred and delayed, and customer services that cannot be provided in a business where revenues are down to that degree. And so one of the solutions that we actually have been talking about here in Washington that I think would go a long way in helping some of these distressed facilities is actually around the Transportation Infrastructure Finance and Innovation Act program, or TIFIA. I suspect most people on this call are familiar with that acronym, which is a federal loan program that provides great flexibility to be able to support toll road projects across the country. Of TIFIA's $27 billion or so portfolio, about 52% of that portfolio is made up of toll roads, all of which are suffering significantly with revenue declines during this COVID crisis. There are a number of state DOTs across the country who have initiated and sparked a dialogue here on the Hill about an opportunity where, for a short period of time, the U.S. Secretary of Transportation could actually reset TIFIA interest rates as part of both the strategy to help distressed assets, toll road service providers, and also be part of the economic recovery in the short term post-COVID. And I'll tell you how this works. If you look at an asset like our 495 express lanes here in the Washington area, we closed our TIFIA loan in 2008. So we have an interest rate of about 4.45%. And for those of you not familiar with the TIFIA program, the interest rate is not a reflection of risk. It's not, Rob, like you and I going to get a mortgage for our house and we had different credit scores, and that's not how TIFIA works. It's really a reflection of the time that you close the loan. So given the timing of our loan, our interest rate is 4.45%. If the government were to reset that interest rate to current rates of about 1.3%, that would generate about $200 million of value on 495 that could do two things. Help our business as it seeks to recover from catastrophic revenue drops during the COVID crisis, but more important, could help support the expansion of 495 and replacement of the American Legion Bridge here from the Virginia side as part of the near-term economic recovery, a project that Virginia and Transurban are prepared to break ground on as early as next year. So I think those are the kinds of solutions that, while governments, we talked about the crisis in the transit industry, there's a long line of service providers who need government funding to help them recover from this crisis. This TIFIA reset solution, I think, is very creative because it says, let us give you the tools that you need, will reduce those long-term financing costs without a change in risk on the project, and then we can then deploy private capital to help solve the problem. It's a very innovative solution. The example I think of what you mentioned about people getting innovative on solutions. So we hope that Congress will consider that as they consider ongoing recovery proposals.
And you think that's the legislative vehicle for that, as some kind of infrastructure recovery package? That would make most sense.
You're never going to back me into predicting what Congress will do, or whether there'll be a phase 4, or whether we'll address reauthorization. I'm sure people will be speculating a lot this week. Well, I'll focus on the transportation solutions, and let the policymakers and politicians decide that. But we certainly believe that it is critical. The federal government has a nearly $30 billion portfolio of assets that are facing some real challenges, and we need to find a way to address those as we look at solutions for transportation service providers across the country.
I think that's great, and folks should look up the specific proposals around TIFIA. As you mentioned, IBTTA. They've got a lot of details on what that proposal would look like on their website. There's been some hearings and testimony. Folks should check that out too. But let me ask you about that, but P3s just kind of in general then. So what does the future, this is tough to predict everything, but what do you think the the appetite's going to be for P3s going forward. We talked about the capital challenges that cities and states and metros are happening. You talked about the challenges with some of these mega projects and procurement issues, things like that. But does our post-COVID future, as best you can predict, mean that we're going to be seeing more of an appetite for these projects, less, certainly more creativity that would kind of go along with P3s? But what's your general prognosis about that?
Well, someone told me the other day that I'm the last remaining optimist in the P3 community in the US. I hope that's not true, but I am an optimist, and our team is actually very optimistic right now. And here's, I think, what the secret is, and to actually seeing public-private partnerships play a more meaningful role. It is disheartening to have a major transportation policy dialogue today around a bill that is pretty light on references to public-private partnerships. If you had told me that 20 years ago, I don't know that I would have gone into perhaps another business. But I'll tell you, the reason I'm optimistic is that we are looking at more modern solutions now that use technology, that are consumer focused. The express lanes here in Northern Virginia is about one example. Transurban's network here, we save customers about 3.3 million hours a year. We have if you're going to the beach on a Thursday night, last summer, you would have saved 3 hours over a 30-mile stretch on your way to the beach. You would have been able to reduce your commute by 50 minutes across some of the most congested roadways in the country to get home at night by using the Transurban's express lanes. And so I think when we look at tolling solutions, when customers are getting those kinds of outcomes, and we look at them as customers, and we design programs that are worthy of their business, then they start to look at tolling in a much different way. And they start to see tolling as something they pay for to get a better service, just like they do Amazon Prime, just like they do Instacart and other convenience services. And that's how our customers view these roads. When customers and then voting constituents begin to see tolling in that lens, through that lens, then that opens up opportunities for us to be able to advance these projects. We've seen that with what is a, relatively speaking, in the transportation industry, rapid increase in express lanes in major cities across the country. And that's driven by the fact that they're providing the service and customers really see the value that they get. So when you look at public-private partnerships, for example, on public toll facilities, that's why I think we need to start now in 2020 with more modern customer-focused solutions. You take a toll road facility that's been around for a number of decades, and you design a partnership that will enable more flexibility in the capital structure, in the operations and delivery, and the deployment of more technology. You have customers that are saving time. They may pay a lesser toll, a decreased toll for that service, who may see the inclusion of modern technologies that will enable them to then begin to optimize the autonomous features in their vehicles that will improve safety. These are the kinds of things that these partnerships can deliver and have delivered in other places around the world, including Transurban's Queensland network. And when we start to see that happening, it's not just about a big check. It's not just about a financial transaction. When public-private partnerships are viewed through the lens of a multi-billion-dollar check, sure, that's great. That'll fund transportation is a critical part of the need, but it's only half the equation. You have to have that customer-focused part of the solution in order for these solutions to work. Once we get a couple of examples of that in the US, I think we'll see what happened to the express lanes, where more and more governors and authorities, public authorities, are going to look to these solutions because they're solutions they will be able to sell, because of the solutions that their constituents want. So I think that's, I am optimistic, and I think that we're going to see more and more of that. And it only takes one or two. It doesn't take, a widespread change. It takes one or two examples for consumers and for government decision makers to see clearly the opportunity that these kinds of partnerships can deliver.
I think that's true, and what we have seen here at Eno too is just this really insatiable demand for places to learn from one another. They're looking for ideas, they're trying to replicate things in their own place. So I think you're right about the way that good ideas will spread, especially post-COVID. We're going to still do things, but folks are looking for all kinds of different solutions. So I think you're right about that too.
One quick concern on that, very briefly, and I don't know the answer. So hopefully somebody on this webinar has it and can send it to us. But one thing that I know the state DOTs are going to have to overcome is these projects do require some seed funding initially to get projects moving on the greenfield side. lesser extent on brownfields or on partnerships for public toll road assets. These partnerships can move forward pretty quickly. The transactions usually can be done in about 9 months' time, and that's been the precedent around the world. Greenfields obviously take a lot longer, and they do require some upfront funding. Our concern would be that with the serious situation that state DOTs are facing, they're not going to have that funding to be able to get projects moving like this. So the private sector can come and should come to the table through unsolicited proposals and other means to tee up great ideas, but the state has a huge role to play in leading, and they need some funding to be able to do that. So one of the things that we must do before we, in order to support public-private partnerships, is support what AASHTO is doing, and that's advocating for $50 billion just to get them back up to the baseline, because we can't have them falling further behind because of COVID, because not only will traditional projects not happen, but public-private partnerships can't happen either. So that proposal by AASHTO is critically important.
So that seed money, so shoring up the states is critical. The seed money is critical. What does the seed money look like? Is that, we've got some questions here about pre-development project support. Is that what we're talking about here, or is it project?
So I think my colleagues in the states across the country understand their oversight models better and can tell you, but this is usually in the tens of millions of dollars that states need to spend to be able to get these projects up and running. There is a solution, and going back to that flexible procurement model, if you get the private partner into the process earlier, like Virginia has done, for example, on the 95 express lanes, where we're developing together the Fredericksburg extension, and we're developing together the 395 to make sure we get a great deal for taxpayers, but we're also in a flexible arrangement where we can meet community needs and to be able to change the project as we move along and new needs are identified or new challenges or obstacles are uncovered. And so those kinds of flexible programs enable then the private sector partner to also be putting money to work to be able to move those projects forward. And that's a really important part of the project development approach, where you act a more active partner who is willing, because of that model, to spend and to be able to share those costs as states move forward. Instead of waiting for the states to put the project together, package it, procure it in a very rigid way, and hope that someone can deliver it to those requirements and meet the promises that they've made in that really rigid process. The project development agreement approach gives you a lot more flexibility and a lot more opportunities to bring private capital to work, not just post financial close, but actually in the development stage of the project as well.
And I think truly shows that it really, when we say P3, one of those P's is a partnership, right? So it really is a partnership between these entities. It's not offloading things, it's not selling assets. When done right, it really is a partnership, and that balancing of risks and rewards is really at the heart of a lot of these deals, as you know. And a lot of questions have come in about that specifically. I'll just try to, I think the general question here is about the private sector's appetite for taking on risk post-COVID, right? So we know the things that the private sector will take on the risk for, things they can control, things that they feel like they have expertise in. It's, what do we do now? It's all out the window. COVID has upended everything. What does risk look like post-COVID for private partners?
Yeah, so a few things. I think one trend that we're already seeing in the market that is very concerning is that, you know, domestic design build contractors are backing away from these large multi-billion-dollar public-private partnerships. That is an issue that must be solved because the risk profile has been off, and it goes back to that rigid process, trying to deliver a very complex multi-billion-dollar project under a very rigid procurement approach. And there are players in the market, and we'll say it, who are overly aggressive in the promises that they make and can't deliver on them and don't deliver on them. And I think that rigidity is a real issue. And we've seen domestic design builders move away from that model, and that's concerning. So we need to address that piece as it relates to investor appetite for companies like Transurban and our partners. We have seen certainly no slowdown in appetite for infrastructure assets in the North American market. Again, globally, this market is perceived as the great emerging market, lots of problems to solve, lots of places to deploy capital, a challenging place to get that capital deployed. That's why I think you'll see Transurban, we've taken an approach of hiring, I have members of my team who have 30, 40 years of experience in maneuvering through the United States NEPA process and the stakeholders and all the unique attributes that we enjoy here in the US that maybe we don't see in other countries. We don't complain about that. We hire people who know how to maneuver through those things and manage those risks. So that's something that needs to be done. But there is still absolute interest in the US market. If you talk to our partners, they will tell you that it's hard to get anyone to go near an airport right now because the perception is that it's like investing in a retail center or mall. So there will be some challenges in that area. But in the toll road space, we're seeing a steady appetite. Even through COVID, we're seeing transactions close. And I think why is what we talked about very early in this discussion. The fundamentals for demand risk toll roads are still very sound. We're still expecting in the decades to come that we'll see an increase in vehicle miles traveled. All the trends send us in that direction. And so we are seeing, again, that investment appetite. Our friends at Macquarie would tell you it's about $200 billion that's sitting out there trying to find its way into investment opportunities here in the U.S. And I will say, I just want to call out our state decision makers on this. One of the reasons that we struggle is because investors don't understand the needs and complexities and of state decision makers and processes, and state decision makers often don't understand the needs of investors. And so the more we can talk about that and close that education gap on both sides, the more states seek feedback from the private sector on how to make projects financially feasible by bundling and other strategies, and the more investors seek to understand. I had a co-investor that was trying to partner with us who came to me and said, I wasn't sure what state we were in, and that's the problem. We can't, as an investment community, fly in and expect to drop capital here. It's about creating meaningful partnerships with teams on both sides who know how to make this market work and deliver real transportation solutions that meet commercial outcomes and meet transportation economic outcomes as well. Sorry, a little preachy there, but.
No, and that's why you have, I think, such a strong presence here in this region. Could you have those partnerships on the ground, and I guess in Virginia very specifically? Is that what makes this area, this region special? It's not coincidence that you have these major projects here.
Virginia makes leadership across 5 governors has made this region special, and has created a transportation system that attracts some of the premier employers in the world to come and put their operations here. And it's not just about public-private partnerships and tolling, which they have used to a degree greater than most states across the country. It's because they have not taken sides in this tired debate we have in Washington about whether or not we should do public-private partnerships or traditional funding or transit or highways. Virginia has said, yes, we should do all of those things. We should do public-private partnerships and tolling, and we should do traditional funding sources, and we should have a gas tax, and we should explore BMT as an alternative, and we should look at a whole host of fees to be able to make transportation needs work. And I think that's the real lesson in Virginia. It's not a public-private partnership lesson. It's about let's deploy as many solutions as we can. And that's the example, one of the premier examples of states. I mentioned scrappy, but brilliant's probably more. But I think it's the use of, they're not choosing sides. They're saying, yes, we need all of that. So here in Washington, we need to stop debating. We need all of that, especially now.
And it's lasted several governors, as you said, and several or 2 different political parties as well. So
That's
it's
right.
not even, so it's certainly good ideas that travel fast. We have just a few more minutes left. I'm going to collect a couple here in a very fast lightning round. There's some questions about some of the data and some of the stats you use. I just want to, if you can clarify a couple of things. First of all, someone asked a couple of questions actually about asset recycling, very specifically. In just a few seconds, what's your best definition for asset recycling?
A successful asset recycling is a long-term partnership, a multi-decade partnership with public-private partnership, where the states would continue to have ownership and oversight over public toll facilities, but they would operate, develop and operate them and maintain them over the long term through a partnership with the private sector, where the risk is transferred to the private sector and where opportunities are there to improve service for customers and to reduce their costs. And we predict, again, just as an example, we're not suggesting that these work on all top 10, but in the toll road sector alone, $300 billion of value that's sitting there. Governments look at the natural resources they have all the time, forestry, they look at these assets and they find ways to maximize the value to taxpayers, but have been less hesitant to do that, even though that IMF would tell you that it could be 10 times the value in the terms of the public assets that they have. But it's trying to unlock that value. $300 billion in the U.S. toll road market, top 10, and would net about $180 billion to be able to meet transportation needs.
You had another stat about, I think it was 120,000 transit riders on 395 in the morning post or pre-COVID.
So the Express Lanes network here in the Washington area, Virginia held a hard line that this was first and foremost a transit and carpooling facility. And we have guidance on and requirements to make sure, and we happily do that. On 395, we commit and deliver about $15 million a year in annual transit payments. And that's a commitment we'll deliver for the next 69 years on that asset. And then every day we have buses who utilize that facility and carpool customers. For example, on 495, we've increased carpool ridership by 500% in the few years that we've been operating. And so we actually have customers who enjoy that reliability and speed, but do so either carpooling or in a transit or traditional bus.
And then one other stat, I know we're running out of time. You said 52% increase in traffic in Beijing, I think, post-COVID.
So, and that's the challenge, right? When you see, and again, it goes back to that debate, road versus rail versus public transit. The answer is yes, right? Because even as a network road provider, 52% increase in congestion during peak periods in Beijing, 50% above where they were pre-COVID. And that's because citizens in that city are fearful about returning to public transit options. And we know that will change, but we know from experience, and again, including 9/11 here, that it will take a long time for that to change. So we need to address the transit crisis and be able to refund and continue to provide that very critical service. But we also need to figure out how we're going to accommodate the increase in VMT that is, or vehicle miles traveled, or increase in cars on our local roadways.
Well, it's going to be certainly something to see. I appreciate that you've given us some food for thought and some of your best modelers there at Transurban, helping to think through what this is going to look like. So it's a new world for a lot of us, and it's going to be fascinating to see. I want to thank you very much for sharing your thoughts and your perspectives on all that. And thank you everybody else for your participation here. As I mentioned, this Road to Recovery webinar series will occur every Wednesday at this time. Next Wednesday, we'll be joined by Ed Emmett. He was the Harris County Executive. That's the Houston area during and after Hurricane Harvey. We'll talk about transportation impacts there. You can check out our website for all of our work and all of our webinars at www.enotrans.org. When you're there, you should check out Eno Transportation Weekly. Jennifer gave a great plug for Eno Transportation Weekly earlier. Jeff Davis is the editor for that and has been working around the clock analyzing the new bill coming out of the House. That's the kind of thing you'll be able to see and to enjoy when you read ETW. Again, many thanks to you, Jennifer. It's exactly the kind of conversation we were looking for. Very super substantive and very specific, and I appreciate you taking the time.
Great, thanks, Rob. Appreciate all that Eno does. Have a nice afternoon.
So long, everybody. Have a great afternoon.